Father's Day weekend, 1969. A blue sky over the Great Smoky Mountains. Grass rippling on Spence Field like a quiet ocean. In the middle of it all, a small boy with a shy smile and quick feet. Dennis Martin is 6 years old, playing hide-and-seek with his brothers and a couple of new friends. He ducks into the brush for a prank, just a second, just a laugh, and the forest closes behind him like a curtain. Seconds become minutes. His father calls. The calls turn sharp, then frantic. Rangers are alerted. Radios crackle. A simple family hike snaps into an emergency that will not end. By nightfall, the Smokies, the most visited park in America, feel endless. By morning, they might as well be another country. What follows is one of the largest searches in national park history. Helicopters chop the ridgelines. Bloodhounds pull at their leashes. Lines of people sweep the meadows, then the ravines, then the meadows again. Rain hits hard, fog drifts low, tracks blur into nothing. No footprints. No torn fabric. No bright flash of a child's shirt against the green. Just wind in the grass and the steady rhythm of boots beating a grid into the map. Explanations begin to gather where evidence will not. Lost to exposure. A predator in tall laurels. A human hand moving in the trees, unseen. A scream heard. A figure glimpsed. Reports taken, weighed, filed. The search expands, then stalls, then narrows to hope measured in inches. The Martins keep coming back, because you must, because a parent's map has only one destination. Tonight, we return to Spence Field. We will set the scene of a wholesome outing turned nightmare. We will follow the first frantic hour, then the massive operation that tried to untie a knot of ridges and hollows. We will examine the theories, ordinary, terrible, and strange, and the folklore that rose to fill the silence. And we will face the hardest part, a case with no trace, only the echo of a boy's name carried by the wind. If this grips you, like and subscribe. We begin at the meadow, sunlit, serene, forever shadowed by absence. The plan was simple and good-hearted, a Father's Day weekend hike into the high country of the Great Smoky Mountains, a tradition as old as the memories that kept bringing the Martins back. Bill, the father, carried a quiet authority that made logistics look effortless. Clyde, the grandfather, possessed the easy patience of a man who knew the hills by their smells and shadows. The boys, Dennis among them, moved like bright ideas through summer grass. The Smokies offered what families expect from national parks, safety framed as scenery, adventure trimmed to fit a postcard, a wholesome script where the worst outcome is a blister and a story. They chose Spence Field, a bald meadow near the spine of the Appalachian Trail, because it felt open and friendly, a place where a ridge briefly remembers what it is to be a prairie. The approach rose through laurel thickets and cool tunnels of leaves that stitched sunlight into green lace. Above, the sky was a clean blue pane, humming with insects and the almost silence that hangs over high elevation. Weather reports were kind. Trails were dry. There were no signs in the air to read as warnings, no broken twigs that said, "Turn back," nothing in the measured breath of the mountains to suggest a family should choose anywhere else. Dennis was 6, small for the scale of the landscape but quick in the way many careful children are. He darted, then paused to look back, then smiled and came when called. Around strangers he tucked himself behind his father's leg, around his brothers he was exuberant, a boy who would work up the courage to swim only after watching someone else splash first. He loved the game more than the victory. If a prank made the adults laugh, that was the win. In photographs from that age, children always look like proof that time moves forward. In the meadow, he looked like proof that a day could be exactly as it should be. The walk to the field folded the family into a rhythm, footsteps, chatter, the hush of wind snaking through spruce. Clyde set a pace that kept conversation easy. Bill carried the kind of preparedness you don't notice until it's needed. The boys invented contests the trail could judge, balance on logs, count the switchbacks, name the birds by guesswork. They came out onto Spence Field in the early afternoon like a ship clearing fog, sudden brightness, the view opening in long green sighs toward Tennessee and North Carolina. Blankets went down. Packs opened. Sandwiches became trophies. There is a particular happiness to these moments, everyone a little sun-dazed, the body tired in a way that promises good sleep, the sense that you've won a prize simply by walking toward it. Other hikers were present, the Smokies in June always draw witnesses, and children drifted toward one another the way magnets test for north. A game of hide-and-seek offered itself the instant someone suggested it. Who would resist? The meadow is edged by brush and low timber. To a child, each clump is a castle, each shadow a cave. The grown-ups, meanwhile, practice the ritual of parenthood in parks. You watch without hovering, you laugh without startling, you let joy run its course but keep it in earshot. Bill's eyes moved, his mind tallying shapes. 1, 2, 3, where's 4? Nothing sinister opened the gate. The mood was ordinary, almost drowsy. Sun raking the grass, a breeze combing the blades to a silver sheen. The boys plotted a prank to startle the adults, the kind of harmless scare that ends in laughter and a mock scolding. Dennis ducked into the edge of brush to take his position. It is important to understand that this is not the beginning of a horror film. It is the middle of an American afternoon, and the mathematics of safety seem inarguable, adults within calling distance, a crowd of hikers nearby, the horizon held back by daylight itself. In the family story, there is always the prelude where everyone agrees later that nothing was wrong. Dennis had been himself, playful, responsive, shy with strangers, yes, but never reckless. The trail had been itself, waymarked, busy, familiar to thousands of boots. The Smokies had been themselves, temperate, photogenic, voice lowered to a summer murmur. You can listen for foreshadowing, but what you hear instead is the ordinary, and the ordinary is the cruelest part in any tragedy that begins without a tremor. Bill's attention tracked the game the way a compass attends to north. Call it vigilance or habit, he watched the boys melt into the border of trees, counted the beats in his head until the big reveal. There is a peculiar pause that happens before a surprise, breath held collectively by the players and their audience, and in that pause, the meadow seemed to steady, as if the whole landscape were leaning in. When the first children burst from the brush, yelping with triumph, laughter jumped like a spark across the adults. Then came the second and third. The fourth's absence didn't register as absence, just a longer beat, a better prank. Bill smiled, waiting for the smallest son to spring his ambush. A minute passed, then 2, and the smile thinned. The way unease enters a parent is more physical than intellectual, it pricks the skin first, then rearranges the heartbeat. Bill called Dennis's name, not loudly at first, that would ruin the game, teach the wrong lesson about fear, but clearly enough to pull a boy out of hiding. The brush answered with insect noise and the sound of wind dragging its sleeves through grass. Another call, louder now. Another, sharper. The joke had landed, and now it was time to step out and take your bow. Clyde rose with the measured economy of an older man who has stood up from blankets many times, his eyes were already scanning the line where green deepens to shadow. The other adults stopped smiling. Strangers began to sense the shift that converts a public place into a private emergency. In those first moments, the search still felt like a continuation of the game, adults joining in, promising to be surprised, playing their parts. The difference is subtle but terrible. In the game, the child controls the reveal, in the search, the reveal controls the adults. The meadow's friendliness is a trick of distance. Stand in the center and you can see everything, step to the edge and the world fragments into compartments, brush rooms, tree corridors, gullies that cup sound and fold it backward. A child can be 10 steps away and invisible if those steps are bent by rhododendron and deadfall. Bill moved from call to shout to the kind of voice that splinters on the boy's name. He checked the obvious hollows, the friendly trees, the first dips where a small body might sit to hold in laughter. Nothing gave back a sign. Time in emergencies lies. 5 minutes on a meadow can carry an hour's freight. Rational explanations queue up like polite guests, he circled around, he's hiding longer, he's wandered to the other boys, each explanation falls through the next and lands on the question that will follow this family for years: where could a child go, in daylight, within a circle of watchful adults? On June 14, 1969, at Spence Field, the answer seemed as impossible as it was urgent. Bill told someone to alert rangers. Clyde angled downhill toward the tree line, choosing experience over panic, as if the mountain might answer to an older language. The Smokies do not announce their dangers. They do not roar or bare teeth. They are a labyrinth stitched from living things, sightlines drunk on angles, sound muffled by green walls, slopes that look gentle until your calves begin to burn. In that first hour, before radios crackled, before maps unfolded, before lines of volunteers traced grids across the grass, the Martins learned what generations of locals already knew but never wanted to prove on their own skin: a playground can become a maze with the turn of a head. 1 second of laughter can slide, without ceremony, into a silence that does not give anything back. By the time the first ranger stepped onto the meadow, the family outing had already crossed its border. The picnic blanket was now a command post. The camera, if there was one, had nothing left to photograph. In later retellings, people strained to find the crack in the day where fate seeped in: a choice of meadow, a minute too long, a corner of brush that looked too inviting. But if there is a lesson in section 1 of this story, it is not about blame. It is about the geometry of places where the beautiful and the unforgiving share the same coordinates. The Smokies, under a generous sky, can turn from playground to labyrinth in an instant. It began as a prank with rules everybody understood. The children whispered, pointed, scattered to the meadow's fringes, and folded themselves into the crease where grass becomes brush. The adults watched with that tolerant half-smile parents wear when play rehearses the script of fear without any of the risk. From where the blankets lay, the hiding places seemed safe as pockets: shallow clumps of laurel, waist-high grass, the first darks of spruce. A child could crouch there, count to 30, and spring out shrieking into laughter. That was the whole plan. Dennis chose a spot close to the edge, close enough that he could see the backs of his brothers as they dashed in, close enough that he could hear the grown-ups pretend not to notice. He was small, quick, and keen on doing the joke correctly. The trick in hide-and-seek is timing: you vanish for a beat longer than comfort allows, then come back as if pulled by a string of your own making. He stepped into the brush and let the green close around his shoulders like a curtain. The first reveal broke from the shrubs with delight. One boy burst out, then another, arms crooked like antlers as they charged the blankets, triumphant. Laughter lifted in the afternoon air. A third child came, cheeks flushed, grass seeds in his socks. The fourth did not. The gap between the third and the fourth sealed itself with silence, the kind that first feels like suspense and then like something else. Bill called, lightly at first, "Dennis." With the amiable authority that turns a game into a task without scaring it. No answer. He stood, shading his eyes against the shine of the meadow, scanning the lip of brush for a movement, a flash of shirt, the quick smile of a boy pleased with his own stealth. He called again, louder. The syllables seemed to land short, as if the air had thickened. The boys pointed to where they'd seen Dennis slip in. They were sure it was right there. He went there. He parted the brush with both hands and found only layered green, a braid of stems and leaf and shadow that bent away and sprang back like elastic. He pushed through to the first small hollow, empty. He scanned for the shallow depressions that knees make in soft ground: nothing, only scuffed duff and last year's leaves. The meadow, which a moment ago had been an open room with perfect sight lines, became a hallway with a dozen doors. Other hikers noticed the volume of the father's voice go up, the angle of his body sharpen. It is a contagious geometry: one person's focus tightens the radius around them. Clyde rose and took the perimeter, moving slowly, the way men do when they are searching for sign more than for someone: an imprint, a snag of cloth, a disturbance that would show a direction. The brothers fanned and called, their voices thinner now, questions rising in the pitch. The adults conferred without speaking, the way strangers do when a crowd becomes a team for a purpose no one wanted. The first pass was still play adjacent. Check the obvious. Count to 10. Call again. Look behind the low spruce. The second pass became narrower, peer under the mats of laurel, step into the green and turn in a slow circle, listen for the giggle that betrays a good hiding place. The third pass went past politeness. Bill's voice cracked across the meadow, and heads turned all the way from the trail. His pace, still measured, took on a directionality that read as alarm. He started to run, not far, not away, but along the border where meadow gives to forest, the place where a child could intend to hide but accidentally slip downhill into greater shadow. The ground fell in small humps, sudden and deceiving. A few yards into the trees, the meadow vanished behind you as if a door had swung shut. From the blankets, the distance looked like nothing, from the trees, it felt like elsewhere. A decision was made, call for help now, not after one more sweep. A hiker volunteered to alert rangers. Another kept an eye on the boys. The search, which a minute earlier had been a household version of order, one parent here, another there, shifted into something else. Bill moved through brush fast enough to make sound, calling his son's name into gullies that bent echoes into unhelpful shapes. He checked places a child could go on purpose, then places a child could go by accident. He looked for the small, bright things children drop, he found none. Minutes distort when fear compresses them. 10 can be 2, 2 can be 20. The sun cared nothing for this and kept sliding. Voices multiplied. From the trail, hikers arrived with the tentative stride of people who want to help but fear intruding. A boy, someone said, and the word rearranged their faces. Lines formed without instruction, a ragged chain of adults combing the border in shallow arcs, eyes down for any disruption in the meadow's neatness. The grass gave up nothing but itself. A whistle blew, one of those practical, tin-thin bursts meant to be heard over wind and chatter. Hands raised. The line paused. Someone thought they saw movement. It was a bird. The line moved on. This is how searches start, how they always start, with a pattern imposed on a place that has its own pattern. The forest, indifferent, kept all its rooms unlocked and unnumbered. Bill extended the radius. He worked down a likely draw and back up, lungs hot, voice hoarse now. The ground bore no fresh sign. In places, the duff was too springy to register a child's weight, in others, roots made the earth unreadable. He called, promised rewards, called again. He turned each promise into a prayer. He used the boy's middle name, because parents do when they need to reach deeper. Wind braided his words and carried them somewhere he couldn't follow. When the first ranger reached the field, he took in the scene at a glance, the blanket now a base, the boys on its edge, the father drawn taut as wire, the perimeter dotted with strangers. Procedures clicked into place. Questions, short and functional. What was he wearing? Which way did he go? How long has it been? Where exactly was the last place anyone saw him? A point on the meadow's edge was chosen and marked, as if a pin could keep the past from moving. They began the classic first-hour tactics, a hasty search of the immediate area, concentric sweeps, a check of drainage lines, game trails, and the edges of human-made paths. Someone listened hard at the mouth of each little hollow, the way you do when you hope sound is caught there like a bird. Another person walked with purpose toward vantage points where you could look down into tucks and folds. The ranger's radio barked for additional hands. More were coming. The forest, polite, sunlit, well-traveled, did not look like a place that could hide a child within earshot of his name. And yet it kept doing exactly that. When the boys were asked to show where Dennis had hidden, they pointed, confident. Adults retraced the steps, knelt, peered, parted branches, called into green throats of laurel. Nothing answered, not even a rustle that could be recruited into meaning. At some point, the search crossed an invisible boundary. The adults' faces changed from expectant to set. Strangers stopped saying, "He's probably just," the brothers stopped volunteering guesses that sounded like wishes. The ranger's questions shifted subtly from, where would he choose to go, to, where could he have gone without choosing? The meadow's distances lengthened. The path back to casual conversation dissolved. Later, people would try to locate the exact second when worry became certainty that something was wrong. You cannot. It arrives not as a moment but as a climate, the light seems flatter, the air loses its afternoon ease, every sound that is not a child's voice becomes accusation. Bill kept moving. Clyde kept circling methodically, working the small skills that had served him in other hills and other years. The boys stayed close now, silent, eyes fixed on the green that had swallowed their brother. Within the hour, the call had traveled far enough to draw more rangers, more hikers, more of everybody. No one knew it yet, but the day had already bent into a shape that would occupy thousands of feet and hundreds of maps. What the first hour teaches, it teaches without malice. Even on a popular ridge in daylight, a child can step behind a curtain the land has hung there forever. From that moment, the Smokies became both stage and suspect. By late afternoon on June 14th, the meadow had become a map. Rangers kneeled in the grass with clipboards and grease pencils, sketching the edges of Spence Field and the first rings of forest beyond it. A command post took shape where a picnic had been, a radio on a blanket, a compass on a sandwich wrapper, a paper cup serving as a pin tray for safety pins and thumbtacks. Hikers crowded close enough to volunteer, far enough to avoid getting in the way. The first rule of a search is deceptively simple: start where the missing was last seen, then move out in careful circles. The first mistake is just as simple: let urgency smudge the circles. They began with a hasty search, the fast, instinctive sweep across all the likely spots close at hand. Bill and Clyde, shoulder to shoulder with rangers, combed the meadow's perimeter and the first 100 yards into the trees. Children can fold themselves into the smallest contradictions in a landscape: the crease behind a fallen log, the pocket under rhododendron where briars knit a tent low and mean, the shadowed mouths of root ball caves created by storm-toppled spruce. Teams peered into each. They called. They listened for a child's voice, for a whimper, for the specific way a name sounds when a boy answers from inside his fear. The forest gave back only its ordinary noises, which can feel like mockery when you need one sound in particular. Before dusk a helicopter thumped across the ridgeline, rotors combing the air above the Appalachian Trail. The pilot banked to let observers study the open ground of the bald, then rolled low over the green seams that stitched the bowl below Spence Field. From above, the country looks honest, lines and plains and light. From the ground, it lies, angles hide angles, and every ridge throws a blind corner over the next. Voices came up through the rotors in clipped bursts from handheld radios. Negative here. Moving to the next draw. Copy. The pilot lingered until fuel argued him back to base, and the silence that followed felt louder. Night drew a line across the meadow. Flashlights began to write pale commas among the trees. Volunteers arrived from trailheads as the word spread: a child missing, a family wrecked on a high green reef. Park staff took names, handed out assignments, and repeated their two mantras: stay on your line, and report everything. The boys were led away from the hubbub, tucked under a stranger's lone blanket with water and the soft tyranny of being told to rest. Bill refused to sit. Clyde worked the edges with a soft step and a lamp held low, the old-fashioned way of throwing light across the ground to catch shallow relief where footprints might show. The mountains breathed cool and damp and very much themselves. Rain came in hard, punctuated bursts after midnight, ran from leaves in silver curtains, and slicked bark and stone. Later, people would blame those hours for confusing what sign there might have been: rain's fingers pushing tracks into blur, scent into slurry. The last good light of day is precious in a search. The first bad rain after dark can feel like a door slamming. Still they moved. Rangers checked the shelters on the nearest sections of the Appalachian Trail: Russell Field, Spence Field, waking whomever they found, asking the question that opens every sleeping face in an instant: have you seen a small boy? At first light on June 15th, the search changed scale. Trucks brought more personnel. Radios multiplied. A folding table and maps appeared beneath a tarp strung between two trees. A grid was drawn over the contour lines, and teams were assigned to squares. The plan was simple: put boots on every square inch of the highest probability terrain while the hours were still within the window when a small body can keep its warmth. Bloodhound teams arrived, veteran noses low, handlers coaxing them to the last known point. The dogs cast, testing the air for that strand of human smell that can be tracked through confusion. They pulled into the trees, angling with intent, then stalled near water where scent braided with creek vapor and vanished. Handlers circled, tried again, walked back to the LKP, the shorthand for last known point, then went forward anew. The dogs' leashes drew question marks on the morning. By mid-morning, a line search ran like a stitch along the contour. 20 people spaced at arm's length moved their boots together, each responsible for the small arc of world between two ankles and two knees. Eyes down. Call anything unusual. A bottle cap might be a clue, a scrap of red fabric might be a shirt, a dead branch scuffed into a new angle might be sign of a passage. Once an hour, the line paused and tightened, because lines drift, and the drift is where gaps are born. People not trained to search think the job is to look, people trained to search know the job is to keep your place. As the day wore on, the numbers swelled. More rangers. Local sheriffs. Men and women from nearby communities who knew these hills for their useful work, fence mending, hog chasing, ginseng finding, logging, and could read a slope for what it wanted to hide. The FBI sent agents, not because a crime had been proved but because for a child the possibility had to be counted. The Green Berets came too, special forces who were told to move quietly, to work in small, efficient teams, to ignore the chatter and let their discipline keep them from the group's contagious errors. Their arrival complicated the choreography. Some said they preferred to run independent sweeps, others said they folded in. Either way, olive drab threaded the rhododendron. With numbers comes noise, and with noise comes a paradox. The wider the net, the more likely you are to push past thin evidence without seeing it. People step on the very thing they're desperate to find. On Spence Field, within 24 hours, 1,000 boot soles had laid a new, human skin on the land. In muddy patches, prints piled over prints until the ground looked like hammered leather. Down in the draws, the green turned into a clutching mess that swallowed trouser legs and logic. Search commanders adjusted, tighten the spacing where the cover is thick, loosen where the slope is too steep for a child. They changed the size of the boxes on the map, like a fisherman changing mesh. Helicopters returned, slinging low along drainages, sometimes broadcasting a father's voice through a loudspeaker in the brittle hope that the familiar sound could pull a boy toward a clearing. In some places the machines could not go, air too thin in the hot hours, wind too squirrely near the broken edges of the ridge. Fixed-wing aircraft traced lazy orbits looking for color that didn't belong. From the sky, searchers could read the broader grammar of the mountain, where water gathers, where game trails braid, where a ridge dies and the land drops torqued and sudden toward coves that look close on a map and live far in the body. On the ground, teams checked the ugly possibilities first. They peered into blowdown tangles where a small form could be held fast. They probed sinkholes and the mouths of small caves, lay on bellies to shine lights into limestone's teeth. They crawled along the cold lips of creeks, hands cold as they moved aside stones in places where, God forbid, a boy could be pinned out of sight. When they called, they also listened for other signs, flies gathering where they shouldn't yet, the metallic sweetness of something wrong. Nothing. The Smokies answered with the smells and ticks and groans they offer any summer day. The second day bled into the third, and fatigue arrived like a second weather system. Commanders cycled teams to keep eyes sharp. Coffee and sandwiches appeared, delivered in coolers and cardboard by people who wanted to do something tangible. A runner kept the log, time, team, sector, result, negative, negative, negative. It is the arithmetic of hope to add zeros and insist the sum must mean something soon. Rumors began to fray the edges of order because rumors always do. Someone thought they saw a scrap of cloth, it was a fungus bloom bright as laundry. Someone heard a cry. It was a fox breaking its voice against the trees. A volunteer swore a footprint, the measurement put it too big by a child's worth. Rangers encouraged reports while trying to keep the map from becoming a collage of wishes. Bill listened to everything, as any father would, then went where the next maybe was. Clyde stayed steady, working the lines he trusted, as if steadiness itself could lay a trail back to a boy. By the end of the first week, the numbers were enormous, hundreds upon hundreds of searchers spread across miles of steep country, dancing the same precise clumsy dance, heads down, shoulders burning. The Park Service borrowed tactics from wildfire crews, established divisions, assign branch directors, communicate with brevity. When storms punched in around midday, searchers huddled under ponchos and watched rivulets write temporary maps on the ground. When sunlight returned, steam lifted from duff and made the forest smell like a pot of tea. Dogs came and went, some pulling hard for a minute on a line of scent and then losing it where water braided it unwieldy again. Failures teach too. Teams learned to keep radio checks predictable, to call out when they encountered terrain traps that could conceal for yards at a time, to mark with flagging where they had found nothing so that the same hollow wouldn't be searched 3 times while another went unvisited. The command post grew a habit of evening briefings, circles of weary faces tilted toward a map that had become more eraser than pencil. Tomorrow, someone would say, we'll widen this sector, tighten that one, bring in a fresh dog team, re-interview everyone who was on the meadow. They did re-interview. The goal was geometry, fix in space and time the last place and minute that Dennis was indisputably himself. They drew bearings from that point like spokes from a hub and measured how far a small body could travel under its own power, then how far it might be carried by water, by gravity, by accident. The math was cold. The hope was warm. The land ignored both and kept its own counsel. In the second week, quieter strategies joined the loud. A few searchers were told to leave their boots and walk the country the way the old ones had, soft-footed, eyes not just down but out, listening for the off note that would tell them where to look harder. Others went slow along the Appalachian Trail itself, checking shelters again and talking to thru-hikers who had come miles in the last days and might have seen something without understanding it at the time. Flyers went up at trailheads and stores in the valleys, photographs and a phone number, the humbling ask of any missing poster, if you know anything, please. With each negative day, the official strategy shifted a degree. The concentric circles became ellipses following drainages. The focus moved downslope and down valley, into folds where cool air keeps a different smell and the trees change species like a change of guard. They checked roads reachable by foot in a half-day and parked an unmarked car where it could watch. They tied strings between hypotheses and followed the strings until they broke or tied to another string. Some of those strings led to places beyond the search, phone calls to agencies, checks of distant bus stations, the sort of quiet work an FBI presence makes possible simply by existing. And always, the sheer size of the search pressed its thumb on the scales. When more than 1,000 people comb a mountain, the mountain is never the same again, not for a while. Grass lies down. Moss comes up in palm prints. The soil becomes a palimpsest of good intentions. If the boy left a thread, it might by now be braided into a rope of everyone else's. By the time weeks, not days, were being counted, the search had become both machine and vigil. The machine part ran on plans and check-ins, fresh assignments, updated sectors. The vigil part ran on the quiet stubbornness of people who could not accept that the land would keep its secret forever. Bill Martin stayed, because there was no other place the muscles of a father's body would allow him to be. Clyde stayed, because old men know that persistence sometimes does the work hope says it will. Rangers stayed because the badge, in these moments, means you say, one more pass, when the math says, enough. The Smokies stayed, too, green and immense and withholding, their creeks talking their summer talk, their laurel asking its little thorny questions of every pant leg that passed. No tracks, no clothing, no body. Helicopters dwindled. Volunteers went back to jobs and fields. The command post thinned to the bones of necessity. The map came down. The meadow was a meadow again, at least to people who hadn't stood on it and watched a search inhale and exhale for half a month. What remains from those days, beyond the logbooks and the clipped radio transcripts and the vanishing flags of surveyors' tape, is a shape in memory, the largest search many had ever seen, immense enough to make error inevitable and still too small to requisition certainty from a terrain that refuses it. When the mountains fall silent, people fill the quiet with theories, because there is nothing else to put there. And where there is silence, speculation fills the void. When a search ends with no trace, the mountain does not change, only the story does. It begins to branch. Each branch is a theory, and each theory is a way of explaining how a child could vanish within earshot of his name. None of these branches end in certainty, but each has its own internal logic, its own gravity. We will take them one by one, the ordinary first, then the terrible, then the ones that ask us to consider another person moving inside the same patch of trees. Hashtag Theory 1, Lost in the Wilderness, Misadventure and Exposure. The simplest explanation is often the hardest to accept. A 6-year-old slips behind the green curtain at the margin of a meadow, becomes turned around in the brush, and follows the most persuasive path available, downhill. In the Smokies, downhill is not a direction, it is a decision you make again and again as the land tips you from one shallow fold into the next, and then into the dark crease where water runs. A child can be within 200 yards of a parent's voice and not be in the same world. Essayer, Search and Rescue, has a body of quiet knowledge about what children do when lost. The patterns are not iron laws, but they repeat often enough to guide maps and feet. Small children hide. Not from malice, but from the reflex that made hide-and-seek fun a minute ago. If you are frightened, you make yourself smaller. You crawl under laurel that adults will not crawl under. You press into rhododendron thickets that blunt sound and turn shouts into felt vibrations. You sleep when you should shout. You ignore open trails because open feels exposed. The day Dennis disappeared, the first hour's searches picked the obvious pockets and perimeters. The days that followed combed drainages and draws, the very places where a small body, cooling, would go quiet. Rain came in the night and again in pulses after dawn. If a trail of sign had existed, rain would have pressed it into vagueness. Dogs, which can turn scent into a thread, lost that thread near water again and again. A 6-year-old can travel farther than many assume, especially if the slope is lending the body its own momentum. At the same time, many children are found close to where they were last seen, tucked into places adults don't assign to possible. What argues for misadventure is the setting itself, rugged slopes, thick cover, sudden weather, the confusion of sound in a bowl of hills. What argues against it is the scale and persistence of the search. Hundreds of people walked those bowls in overlapping grids for days. The ugly places, the traps, the holes, the tangles, were checked and rechecked. Exposure takes a body, it does not spirit it. Even months later, even after rain and animals, a shirt, a shoe, a scrap of color tends to show somewhere. Here, nothing did. There is also the human rhythm of the first hour to consider. Bill's calls came quickly, the radius extended quickly, the request for rangers went out quickly. If a child had simply moved 10 or 20 yards into the trees and then a similar distance downhill, one expects, if not an answer, then at least an impression in the duff or a scuff on a log to start a line of inference. The land, which often leaves little clues like breadcrumbs, did not leave even a crumb. And yet this theory refuses to leave, because it does not need an accomplice. It asks for no more than a moment's disorientation and a landscape gifted at multiplying that moment. It is not dramatic, it is not cinematic, it is simply the kind of misfortune that hides in ordinary days, waiting for 2 or 3 small things to line up in the wrong order. Hashtag Theory 2, Animal attack, bear, cat, or something with teeth. The Smokies are not a zoo, they are a country with citizens that do not carry identification papers. Black bears move through these elevations with the heavy grace of animals that own their space. Bobcats go about their business like shadows with opinions. Large cats of the cougar kind were officially absent by the mid-20th century, though rumors kept them walking. Boar root through the understory in gangs that sound like a minor storm. Could a predator have taken a 6-year-old from the edge of a meadow, swift and silent, in daylight? Black bears do attack, but rarely, and usually for reasons that leave a signature: defensive charges near cubs, food-conditioned aggression at camps, a wounded animal's pain. Predatory attacks on humans by black bears are unusual. When they occur, they are messy in ways the land remembers: drag marks, blood, torn fabric, disturbed soil, a trail of sign that dogs and eyes can read. Even if a large animal carried a small body into cover, pieces tend to tell on the event later: bones, clothing, something that refused digestion or decay. A bobcat could injure, but a bobcat is not large enough to carry away a child in the manner that this disappearance would require. A cougar would be large enough, but the official stance at the time made cougars a rumor more than a resource for explanation, and again, the scene would likely mark itself. A boar may harm, but the scenario strains under daylight and distance. Out in the open, with adults nearby, a loud, chaotic attack would have brought witnesses running to noise they could not ignore. There is another difficulty. The moment of disappearance was bracketed by other children popping out of hiding and by adults looking into the very brush that Dennis entered. An animal attack violent enough to remove a child would likely have made a sound that would be remembered for its wrongness: a scream, a thrashing, an alarm in the birds. The one scream reported that day was not heard at Spence Field, it was heard miles downslope by another family. We will come to them shortly. Predator theories persist because they are simple, and because fear respects teeth. But simplicity must still account for evidence, and here the evidence is negative. No torn cloth. No blood. No drag. No sign. In a place this searched, silence itself becomes evidence against fawn and claw. Hashtag Theory 3, Human Abduction, a hand in the trees. There is a third lane between accident and animal, a person. The idea shocks, then compels, because it explains what the other theories cannot: a clean removal. In this lane lives the most discussed witness account in the case. That afternoon, a Tennessee family hiking in a valley below the ridge heard what they later described as a piercing, distressed cry, a sound that made them stop. Minutes after, they saw a man in rough, disheveled clothing moving quickly through the trees, carrying something over his shoulder, angling away rather than toward the path. The place they were, near a creek with the kind of cover that eats a figure in 3 steps, gave the sighting a furtive edge. The man did not wave. He did not ask for help. He moved like someone with a purpose that did not wish company. They reported this to a ranger, placing the scream and the figure in the same rough hour as the disappearance. Distances in mountains are deceitful. Down below can be quite near if you are sound, it can be another world if you are walking. Could a person, watching the meadow from within the green, have time to grab to the rhythm of the children's prank and carried a child into cover before anyone's attention moved from laughter to alarm? Could that same person then have descended the slope, using the folds of the land as hallways, until the ridge hit him from helicopter and the brush hit him from lines of searchers? What argues for abduction is the cleanliness of the scene, the absence of trace, and the strangeness of that downslope sighting. What argues against it is the difficulty of the act in precisely those few minutes, in precisely that company, in precisely that place. The margin of brush was close, the adults were closer, children emerged in waves. To step in, overpower a small body without a cry reaching a father's ear, and step out carrying that body, then thread the trees fast enough to make daylight your accomplice, this is not impossible, but it is a choreography that asks a lot of luck from a theory that already asks for nerve. Investigators treated the possibility seriously. The presence of the FBI in the days after the disappearance was not proof of kidnapping, but it told you how authorities had to think when a child goes missing and the land refuses to answer the simplest questions. Leads were checked. People who had been on trails and at trailheads were interviewed and re-interviewed. Cars were noted. The rangers did the boring, necessary work of closing the gates that abduction theories open: known offenders, recent drifters, men seen camping alone near access points, anyone with a story that bent where most stories do not. The account from the family in the valley retained its unsettling edges. A scream, then a man moving like a secret. But time distorts, and so do memories under strain. The distance between Spence Field and the sighting area, measured on a map, can be coaxed into coincidence. Measured in legs and breath, it is considerable. The interval between scream and figure was not a stopwatch's report, it was a human recollection. And what was carried? A child? A deer? A pack? The forest, once it has been enrolled as a conspirator by fear, can make any shape over a shoulder look like an answer. There is a narrower version of the abduction theory to consider as well, not a stranger's singular crime, but a human encounter that began as something else and went wrong. A child meets a person in the trees. The person intends mischief of a lesser order, or intends nothing at all, and then the world tips as panic enters. The result is the same, the clean removal, the unmarked ground, but the motive is smaller, sadder, more human. This version has even less to stand on than the stranger over the shoulder. It is a story told to close a different kind of silence. ## weighing the branches. Each theory carries its own math. Misadventure requires only the land and a child's instincts, but it must explain the total absence of trace despite the largest search many had ever seen. Predator requires teeth, but it must explain why those teeth left no mark to read. Abduction solves the cleanliness problem neatly, but it must squeeze a criminal's choreography into the narrowest window and cooperate with a geography that does not enjoy being used. People adopt the theory that allows them to live with the story. For some, wilderness is enough, a thing beautiful and indifferent, into which a small boy wandered and could not be found because the mountain is better at hiding than we are at looking. For others, the idea that a person could come so close to a family under a blue sky, do a thing that small and that large, and then move away unrecorded is the worst explanation and therefore the truest. Between them is the argument every such case produces, whether the greatest danger is the world itself or the people who move inside it. Professionally, what lingers for searchers and investigators is the geometry of impossibility. The first hour was fast. The lines were tight. The dogs, even when confused by water, had noses that usually find at least the beginning of a story. The helicopters put eyes on the obvious corridors. The days were many. And yet the sum is zero. The Smokies kept to their habit, to be generous with scenery and stingy with evidence. For the Martins, theories were not intellectual furniture, they were rooms you had to live in, each for a while, until its walls pressed too close and you moved to another. They tried the map of misadventure and walked it for years. They stared hard at the idea of an animal because to imagine a wild thing is, in some ways, easier than to imagine a human one. They listened when law enforcement listened to abduction, and they suffered the way any parent suffers under a theory that needs a villain but cannot seat one at a table. What the case did, in the absence of proof, was invite other stories to sit down and pretend to be evidence. In the valleys, around kitchen tables, on porches that look up at ridges blue with distance, people told the versions that fit their sense of the world. Some stuck to the practical and the sad. Some turned toward the shadowed edge where rumor and folklore touch palms. And from abduction theory, stranger tales began to take root. There is a way a mountain keeps a story when the facts run out, it hands it to the older voices. In Appalachia, those voices know names for shadows and etiquette for trees. They will tell you which ridges hold grudges, which hollers don't like to be walked after dark, which creeks talk too much when they're up to something. When Dennis Martin vanished and the search ended with nothing to hold, the case slid along a familiar rail, from official report to local cautionary tale, from logbook to porch light. What took Dennis? If the land would not say, then the land's folklore would try. Wild men, is the phrase that returns like a burr on pant legs. It does not mean one thing. Sometimes it means a loner, a hermit living on trout and stubbornness, a veteran who came home loud inside and went quiet outside, a man with a shack so far off trail you only find it by mistake. Sometimes it means a rough camp with meat smoking and junk stacked in the weeds, a place that tells you to go around without anyone saying so. And sometimes, whispered with the care people use for matches near gasoline, it means something else, people who have slipped out of the world we share, living feral in crews or clans, no law but their own and that one not written. A sighting fed that vocabulary. In a valley below the ridge that held Spence Field, a Tennessee family reported a scream that did not sound like a fox or a child playing it being one. Minutes later they startled at the sight of a disheveled man cutting through the trees, moving fast with something slung awkward over his shoulder. The man did not behave like a hiker in any ordinary trouble, he behaved like someone who wanted to be between points without becoming a point himself. One detail, a scream-man figure pairing in the right hour, grew a second life. Around Rowan's Creek, the whispers put the two together and wrote a shape in the space between them. The search, for its part, did what searches do, it noted the report, drew lines on a map, measured what a boy could do on foot, what a man could do with a burden, what daylight allows and distance denies. The official answer never crowned a theory. But the story that Appalachia tells itself is not bound to officialness. It is bound to memory and mood. Older men will sometimes tell you about a time, long ago or last winter depending on their appetite for being believed, when they came over a rise and found a camp that felt wrong. Not just messy or poor, wrong. No voices, those signs of people, no tracks, though a path had to exist to bring the trash in. A deer carcass hanging from a limb with a geometry that suggested practice. A smell you wouldn't call rot but also wouldn't call food. These are the little stories that swarm toward a big story like iron filings finding a magnet. They do not prove anything. They do not try to. They simply say, we've seen enough to know we haven't seen everything. There is, too, a deeper seam of mountain talk that reaches under English. The Cherokee, whose names still watermark these hills, carry old warnings about beings that take what is precious at the edge of sight. Those warnings were not written for YouTube or tourists, they were weather reports for spirits. A child must be taught the price of wandering. A voice in the laurel is not always a bird. A bright opening is not always a safe one. To drag those teachings into a modern case would be unfair to both. But folklore is a solvent, it seeps. The Smokies are layered with it. When a boy disappears and the ordinary reasons cannot nail the moment to the ground, the old categories rise in the mind like mist, haints, boogers, wood witches, the slant-eyed giant whose name you do not say loudly in spruce. By the second week, the search's machinery had a ghostly double, a second search conducted by rumor. At a store at the foot of the mountain, someone swore they'd heard about a cave with signs of occupation. On a porch, a woman remembered how her grandfather never went through that one saddle after sundown. A volunteer told a ranger about a shack he'd once seen that seemed to be new every time he looked at it, as if it grew from spare parts. The ranger nodded and wrote, because prudent people write, and because in country like this a rumor can sometimes be a compass point even when it is wrong. Then came the theory's darker flowering. Feral people, is the phrase that internet forums like to use for Appalachia when they want to turn the region into a stage set. The story goes like this, an off-grid clan, violent and practiced, moving at home in the brush, took a child the way a hawk takes a chick, swift, silent, and toward cover. The proof offered is always the same, the absence of proof of anything else. It is a neat circle if you want one. It is also a circle that can make a caricature of the mountains by mistaking poverty or privacy for monstrosity. Local people, who will tolerate a fair amount from a theory if it minds its manners, tend to hesitate here. They know men who live rough and leave you be. They know that moonshiners and ginsengers and folks who keep to themselves have more to fear from attention than anyone has to fear from them. They know that a scrap of rough clothing and the choice of a deer trail over a footpath does not make a kidnapper out of a man already wary of crowds. And they know, perhaps most painfully, that a mystery does not owe a debt to legend just because legend is good at collecting. Still, the wild man idea fits the story's gap like a key carved in the dark. It explains the cleanliness where the other theories smear. A practiced woodsman could ghost the tree line. A man who has learned not to be noticed could choose the seconds when laughter covered the cough of movement. He could refuse the trail we would take and run the one deer and hog and men who don't want company take, a braid of soft ground and shadow that sidesteps the places a helicopter likes to look. This is the version the Rowan's Creek sighting keeps on life support. And it will not entirely die, because there is no body to drag it to a grave. Alongside the human-shaped folklore, the supernatural took its share of the empty bowl. A child stolen by something not a man but wearing men's habits, a spirit of the green that asks payment in an offering not freely given, the mountain's old beings reminding newcomers that parks are lines on paper and not spells. Those versions are rarely told straight. They come out as a half-joke, a softening of a terrible possibility with an older terrible possibility that somehow feels kinder because it refuses to be personal. Grief will sometimes take the myth that harms least. Even the presence of the Green Berets grew its own rumor skin. Their discipline and quiet, good traits in a search, look like secrecy from the outside. People said they ran their own maps, kept their own counsel, moved like people who had been told a different story than the one on the evening news. In truth, soldiers are often asked to help when the terrain is rude and the hours are short. But rumor prefers intention to logistics. It will tell you they were sent because something more than a child was at large. The hills, indifferent, did not confirm or deny. What folklore accomplishes, for the community that tells it, is not resolution but posture. It teaches you how to stand in a place that does not answer. Keep the children close at the edges of meadow. Don't split up at dusk. If the woods go quiet all at once, go the other way. Don't follow a stranger's voice into a thicket. These are good rules whether or not any feral clan has ever laid eyes on you. They are also the old etiquette of living adjacent to a vast, living thing. For the Martins, myth offered no rescue. It could not be walked like a ridge, questioned like a witness, or searched like a drainage. It gave shape to other people's fear but not to the space in their home where Dennis should have been. Bill and Clyde were practical men. They let the mountains be mountains, not mouths. They entertained what they had to, because a parent must push on every door, and then return to what could be done with feet, walk, look, return tomorrow. And yet, even for the practical, the case changed the way Spence Field sits in the mind. A sunny meadow is now two meadows, the one you see, and the one with the curtain forever half-pulled. If you stand there on a clear day and the wind thins for a second, you will hear how quickly silence makes stories. The Smokies, generous with scenery and stingy with answers, kept their counsel. The tale of wild men took root in the soil that counsel left bare, not because truth demanded it, but because people did. But for the Martin family, myth offered no comfort, only the ache of not knowing, and the long work of living under an unanswered question. In the days after the last helicopter droned away and the final line search collapsed into footpaths back to cars, the mountain looked untouched. That is one cruelty of the Smokies, they heal their surface quickly. Grass springs up where a command post stood, rain rinses maps into pulp, the scent of coffee and diesel is replaced by the evergreen steadier breath. The land keeps no vigil you can witness. People must do that work themselves. The Martins learned the choreography of a long emergency that has lost its clocks. Morning is for deciding where to go, afternoon is for going there, evening is for coming back with the same questions and a smaller voice for asking them. Bill carried himself with a contained force, the kind that makes other men step aside because they recognize something they cannot help or halt. He spoke to rangers the way you talk to partners, short, factual, eyes steady, but he walked like a father, which is to say straight into places that hurt. Clyde, older and slower now, kept a pace that looked like patience and felt like refusal. He took the old man's job of saying what the silence was not allowed to say, "We are not done yet." The Park Service, for its part, extended the search beyond what the math would recommend because human beings live outside math. Teams returned with fresh assignments, then with narrower ones, then with checklists that had the word "recheck" on them as if repetition itself could turn into discovery. Agents filed their reports. Dogs were booked for one more pass. A helicopter was requisitioned when weather and budget allowed, the pilot flying patterns so familiar he could have traced them on the back of his hand. After each cycle, the same column filled in on the ledger, negative. Criticism arrives when hope is tired. Some of it is fair. The first hours of any search write rules in wet ink, and urgency is a solvent that smears those lines. Volunteers trampled sign before dogs could read it. Sectors were doubled while others were skipped when word-of-mouth outran radio. The very scale that seemed merciful, more eyes, more boots, made the ground noisy and the map unfaithful. Bill noticed, of course he did. He spoke quietly but directly about missed chances, about coordination that lagged half a step behind need, about the brutal arithmetic of too much and not enough happening at once. The rangers listened, and some met his eyes. Others looked down at their boots, where the story's erasures had gathered in mud. Contact with the FBI felt like contact with a different weather system. Their questions were square-cornered. Their presence suggested abduction without ever saying the word like a verdict. They checked the outer world, roads, offenders, men who had drifted through a week before and left no name behind. They checked bus stations and stores and cabins for sale. They checked stories against other stories until one of them broke. What they could not check was the place where a boy becomes a mystery and the time it takes for laughter to end. When an incident is officially scaled back, it doesn't end. It changes pronouns. We are searching becomes, we will continue to follow leads. It is a syntactic difference with a canyon inside it. The command post shrank to a phone number. The map came down and left a pale rectangle on the wall of the maintenance shed where tape had protected paint from sun. The ridge returned to its full-time job of being a ridge. And in Knoxville, in Maryville, in towns that were their names on courthouses and little leagues, a family stared at a space at a table and tried to fit their days around it. Bill went back to the mountain because there was no day on any calendar that said not to. He returned in different seasons, trying different logics. Winter clarifies underbrush, leaves gone, sightlines lengthen. Spring gives up secrets when floodwater outs anything that doesn't belong where the creeks run fat. Late summer humbles, but it's when hikers find things and bring them to rangers. He talked to people who looked like they'd rather not talk, because that is also necessary. He shook hands with men who knew which ridges held caches and which held nothing but briars, and he told them what he was asking. Sometimes he went alone, which scares the people who love you and reassures no one, but a man has to make his hands do something. Clyde returned as well, for as long as his legs would carry him. He didn't announce it. He never had. He walked the edges because the edges are where notice begins. He watch-listed hollows in his head like a hunter watches weather. There is a way the old keep faith with land, quietly, repetitively, with an almost superstitious attention to small routines. You step over the same log, you kneel at the same spring, you lay a palm on the same cold stone and ask it to remember a boy's weight. If the mountain carried any of that, it did not tell. Home is not a refuge from a question like this, it is an amplifier. The sounds that used to mean nothing become tests. A door clicks and your whole body turns before the head follows. A neighbor's voice across the hedge climbs a note and you are already in the yard. Photographs on mantles stop being passed and start being accusations. A little shirt found in a drawer can empty the knees from a grown man. People are kind in the American way, casseroles, money for gas, letters that say, praying, and sometimes kind in the worse way, advice from strangers who have decided what happened and who should be forgiven for it. The family learned to nod. They learned to thank. They learned to close the doors softly in a neighborhood that will never be the same neighborhood again. Time, which was the enemy during the search, becomes a carpenter after. It builds additions onto the house of grief. The first is a porch where you can sit with other people who have their own missing, the chairs don't match, but the silence does. The second is a small room where you keep the theories you can bear for a week at a time. You move between the rooms depending on weather. The abduction room is noisy, every footstep on the sidewalk echoes wrong, so you do not sleep there long. The misadventure room is cold but honest, you sit in it with a coat on and tell yourself the mountain did not mean harm. The predator room is locked more often than not, because pain with teeth asks for pictures you don't give your mind unless you're already losing to them. Years pass, which is a sentence that looks cruel on paper and is merely true in life. Birthdays are marked without their subject. Holidays are scaled smaller because big ones are too theatrical without all the players. The park issues statements when anniversaries arrive like unwanted mail, reporters write respectful pieces that have to quote someone, and the someone is often the parent who has mastered saying sentences that do not break. The file grows thicker with pages that say, "No new development at this time." The page that matters most remains blank. Inside the Park Service, the case becomes a touchstone for training. New rangers learn its contours the way medics learn the old wound that made the protocol. Don't flood a scene. Keep better logs. Put dogs in first where you can. Assign a single voice for volunteers. Listen to locals but write their stories separate from your sectors. Re-interview faster. Rebrief with humility. None of these rules guarantee anything. They are habits built from a loss the uniforms will never stop carrying, even as names on shoulder patches turn over and hats are hung on different pegs. In the communities under the mountains, the story does quieter work. Parents use Dennis's name the way old-timers used the word copperhead, as a caution you slide under play. Stay where I can see you. Don't go past that tree. If you can hear me, I should be able to see you. Warnings become etiquette, which is how a place makes rules without making laws. People walk Spence Field with a softness they don't bring to other meadows. Some leave a toy under a spruce. Some take their hat off for one breath. Some hike away fast, as if a pause would pull a string that is best left unpulled. There were kindnesses none of us saw. A ranger who kept a photograph in his wallet and touched it before he went on duty. A neighbor who mowed a lawn without asking, for years, because the grass shouldn't add to the weight. A clerk who learned the family's handwriting and made sure their mail never sat too long in the wrong box. Grief does not only break, it invites these small repairs, and a town that has learned how to be both private and present will do them without applause. What remained for the Martins was the only work left: continue. Return to the ridge when the body insists, write to agencies when memory shakes awake and demands a last check of a distant thing, open the door when a new voice at a new angle says, "I heard something." Keep the house as if the possibility of a knock were still a kind of gravity that could pull a boy back through 40 summers. None of this is rational in the way checklists are rational. All of it is rational in the way a heart is rational when it refuses to let absence be the last word. No remains. No clothing. No definitive trace that could be held up to the light and named. A case file thickened with careful words that say, "We looked, and we did not find." The Martins carried their grief the way mountain families carry any long wait, not as a banner, not as a secret, but as a fact you work around like a stove in a small kitchen. And outside, the trails kept their appointments with feet that did not know the story and feet that did. The breathing lesson of the aftermath is not satisfying. It is simply what is, life continues beside unsolved things. The park's brochures kept their photographs, the meadow kept its silky ripple, tourists kept their selfies with the ridgeline behind them, rangers kept their quiet calendar of days when they rewalk a line because some dates are not allowed to go unmarked. The Martins kept faith with a boy the mountain did not give back. And as years passed, the disappearance turned from case file to legend. Some stories end with a name, a date, and a place you can point to on a map. This one ends with a meadow. If you stand on Spence Field in the right weather, the grass moves like breath and the ridgeline files the sky down to a clean edge. It looks like a place that couldn't hold a secret if it tried. And yet it did. The absence of Dennis Martin is not a line in the park's brochures, but it is a current under the pictures, a hush where the wind hardens for a beat, a pause that turns a picnic into a prayer. 50-some years later, the case keeps a curious double life. In the Park Service, it is a lesson plan, the cautionary anatomy of first hours, grids and dogs, how to keep the urgent from ruining the useful. Among search and rescue people, it is a knot you tie and retie so your hands remember, begin at the last known point, contain your chaos, listen to the hill as if it were trying to help you. In true crime circles, it is a pilgrimage story, told again because the telling feels like work you can do for someone you never met. There, the narrative leans toward theory, misadventure's harsh plainness, predator's teeth, the clean and terrible clockwork of abduction. Each theory promises a kind of sleep, and none delivers. For Appalachia, the memory sits closer to the bone. The mountains have always offered two things at once, beauty and indifference, and people here have long learned to live on the seam. The Dennis Martin story is not only a mystery, it is a parable about margins, the margin between meadow and woods, between laughter and alarm, between a place you trust and a place that does not know your name. Parents pass the caution in small, ordinary sentences: stay in sight, answer when you're called, don't step into the brush for the sake of a joke. The old etiquette becomes the modern warning. It isn't superstition, it's experience with moss and distance. Folklore, faithful as ivy, climbed the facts as soon as the facts stopped growing. Wild men, whispers of feral camps, the figure seen down by the creek, the green berets moving quietly through their sectors, every detail grew a rumor tale because rumor is what communities use to pull meaning from the dark. Sometimes those stories are unkind to the mountains, sometimes they are unkind to the people who live in them. But even the unkind versions confess a deeper truth: the land is bigger than our certainties. A place this complicated can turn coincidence into choreography and leave us arguing over which we saw. What remains for the family, long after the search logs yellow and the anniversary pieces settle into their final paragraphs, is the arithmetic of love without an answer. The Martins learned the calendar of, maybe, winter's leafless sightlines, spring's high water, summer's hikers, fall's clear air. They return to the ridge because the body insists on returning to the last place it remembers being whole. They practice the only ritual that made sense: go back, look again, because rituals keep a door from sealing, even if only in the mind. That endurance is not spectacle. It is what faith looks like when it is forced to live without prophecy. The park, for its part, carries on with its twin obligations: welcome and warning. Trailheads get better signs, rangers train on cleaner checklists, the radios speak with fewer crossed wires. None of that retrofits 1969. It does, however, turn one family's breaking into the kind of knowledge that keeps other families whole. If there is grace in a bureaucratic line like lessons learned, it is here, in the quiet prevention that never makes the news. There is an unfairness in unfinished stories: they require the living to be both archivists and poets. Archivists keep the logs straight, the dates exact, the geography honest. Poets keep the ache from turning into noise. In the Smokies, you hear both voices. One will tell you the search sectors, the dog teams, the weather windows, the distances measured in contour lines and minutes. The other will tell you about a stitch in the air that day, about how the meadow looks different now, about the way a name feels when you say it into green. So the legacy is layered: training manuals and porch talk, caution and reverence, a case file and a ghost story sharing a single address. Hikers crest the rise and shake their heads at the beauty, locals glance at the edge where grass turns darker and remember how quickly a map can lie. Some leave a toy under the spruce. Some take their hats off for one breath. Some stand very still and listen for a sound that isn't there. If you look for an ending, the mountains offer an image instead. It is June light over Spence Field, the grass shouldering the wind, the trail drawing its quiet line toward the next saddle. Somewhere beyond sight, a creek folds its voice into a pocket of shade. The place is ordinary again, which is part of the wound. Nothing here admits what happened, and everything here remembers it anyway. Dennis Martin's case is retold because it names a fear we rarely say out loud: that the world we love can, without malice, take something from us and never return it. Some will keep it as a cautionary tale about wilderness and time, others, as a whispered argument for darker possibilities. Both readings circle the same blank center. The disappearance of Dennis Martin lingers not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. A boy vanished into green silence, leaving only questions carried by wine through the Smoky Mountains.